In 2006, a senior US defense official said the following: "We will see the defeat and dismantlement of Hezbollah within 30 days. 34 days later, a ceasefire was declared. The movement had not been dismantled. In 2003, a senior Pentagon advisor predicted Iran's influence in Iraq will be zero within 5 years of the invasion. 20 years later, Iranian-aligned governments had won every major Iraqi election. In October 2023, every major intelligence agency in the Western world used the same word: unprecedented. Here's what I cannot get past. Every one of those people had access to the best intelligence in the world. Satellites, analysts, decades of field reporting, and the movement they were analyzing, the one they kept predicting the end of, had published exactly what they were going to do in writing, in public statement, and documented a strategy. So when the analysts called it unprecedented, they were not lying. They were describing something their framework genuinely could not process. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is a failure of framework. I have a confession to make. For years, I used the same frameworks everyone else was using: geopolitics, proxy warfare, balance of power, strategic interests. And I would read the analysis, the predictions, the expert assessments, and something kept not fitting. The prediction kept failing. The frameworks kept producing outcomes they could not explain. And so I started asking a different question. Not who is right in this conflict, which we all already know who's right and who's wrong. Not which side should I support. The question I kept coming back to was this: what if the Western analytical framework, the one used to be every major think tank, every government intelligence service, every mainstream news channel, is structurally unable to explain what it is trying to explain? Not because the analysts are unintelligent, but because the movements at the center of this story are operating inside a completely different framework, one that is 1400 years old. And here's the paradox that drove me to make this video for you guys. For over 45 years, the most powerful military and economic forces on earth have applied sustained, escalating pressure on a specific set of movement in the Middle East, or I would call it the West of Asia. And every single time, the pressure produced the opposite of its intended result. That is a documented pattern that demands explanation. And today, I want to give you the framework that explains it, not a political position, a lens, a point of view, built on 1400 years of documented scholarships on how history actually works. I cannot promise you a clean answer, but I can promise you a framework that makes the last 45 years legible in a way nothing else has. To understand what is happening in the Middle East or West of Asia right now, I need to take you back 1400 years, not as a religion, as a documented history. In the 7th century, a small community in the Arabian Peninsula, roughly 300 people, faced a force 3 times their size at a place called Badr. By every conventional military analysis, they should have lost, but they won't. The dominant power of the region concluded they got lucky, a small, unstable community, one surprise victory. A year later, the same community faced a far larger force at a place called Uhud. This time, they suffered a significant military setback. 70 of their people were killed, including one of their most important leaders. The dominant analysis was this is the beginning of the end. 2 years after Uhud, the community entered a peace treaty that appeared by every conventional measure to be a humiliation. They agreed to release prisoners who could return to fight against them. They agreed to condition their own members called unjust. Their allies were stunned. Their own people protested. And yet, the verse revealed immediately after this treaty that looked like a defeat. Indeed, we have given you a clear victory or a clear opening, not consolation. A statement of a structural analysis. 2 years after that treaty, the transformation of Mecca took place without a battle. Now, this is a historical sequence from the 7th century, but here is what this video is about. This is not ancient history. This is the pattern that every movement at the center of the modern West of Asia or Middle East story is consciously mapping itself onto, not as metaphor, as a documented, systematic, predictive framework built on this sequence for how history works. Now let me show you the modern record. 1979. A revolution in Iran produces a government structure around principles drawn from Islamic theology. The dominant Western analysis was unanimous. It will not last. The economy will collapse. The people will turn against it. Within a decade, the Islamic Republic will be gone. 47 later, it is still there. 1982, Israel launches a full military invasion on Lebanon. In the aftermath, a small armed movement emerges, backed by Iran, with the explicit goal of resisting the occupation. The analysis at the time was a minor Iranian proxy, a localized nuance. It will be contained. Over the following 4 decades, through multiple major military campaigns explicitly designed to destroy it, that movement grew. Each campaign was followed by a period in which it rebuilt and emerged more capable than before. 2006, a full-scale military campaign. Stated, goal, destruction. 34 days later, a ceasefire. The UN Secretary General acknowledged that military objective had not been achieved. 2003, the United States invades Iraq. One stated goal, reduce Iranian influence in the Arab world. The United States spent, by its own estimates, over $2 trillion and 2 decades in Iraq. And Iranian-aligned parties won every major Iraqi election held after the invasion. The most severe package of the economic sanction in history was designed to force Iran to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. Predict outcome? Economic collapse. Political capitulation. Actual outcome? Iran developed its first domestic ballistic missile program, its first drone program, its first satellite launch capability, and list goes on and on. The sanctions that were designed to weaken the state instead forced the development of the capabilities it would not otherwise have built. Because when you cannot import something, you learn to make it. But here is where it gets interesting. Because that is not just a story about unintended consequences. That is a pattern. And this pattern was described in precise terms centuries before any of these events happened. Now let me bring this to the most recent event, because it is the clearest demonstration yet. In April 2026, a direct military exchange took place between Iran and Israel, the first direct confrontation of this scale in history. Before it began, the dominant Western analysis predicted Iran's military infrastructure would suffer significant damage. The deterrence equation would shift decisively. The Iranian government would face domestic pressure from the military and economic costs. Here's what independent military analysts and satellite imagery documented after the ceasefire. Iran's ballistic missile capability, publicly described by Western defense analysts as primitive and performed in ways that surprised Western military establishments. Interception systems encountered saturation conditions they had not been tested against. The ceasefire came out not after Iran had exhausted its option, but after diplomatic intervention. 2 interpretations. Same fact. The Western framework, Iran was forced to back down. The alternative framework, Iran demonstrated its deterrence capability and accepted a ceasefire from a position of verified strength. The framework you use determines which one looks like the evidence. And to understand why these two interpretations are so different, you need the framework. There is a tradition of scholarships documented across 1400 years of primary source in Islamic theology and philosophy that has a complete systematic theory of how history works. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. Not spiritual encouragement, not a vague reassurance that good will triumph. A precise, internally consistent framework built on specific Quranic verses and their application to historical events for understanding why certain movements that should have been destroyed instead grew stronger, and analytically, why specific outcomes in specific conflicts were structurally predictable. This framework is called in the Quranic tradition the divine laws of history. In other words, we call it the divine narration. Not a claim about what you should believe, a claim about what the historical record requires you to take seriously. Let me give you 3 of these laws. And after each one, I want you to test it against the historical record we just walked through. Law number 1, pressure purifies. It does not destroy. Pressure applied to a movement rooted in justice does not destroy it. It eliminates the weak and strengthens the core. The framework draws on a specific Quranic principle referred in the context of Uhud that describes what happens when a movement committed to what it understands as justice faces severe external pressure. The principle, the opportunists leave, the uncommitted depart. The committed core remains and becomes more coherent. Tested against the record. 40 years of escalating sanctions on Iran. The stated goal, economic collapse leading to political change. But what happened? Iran built an indigenous defense industry, developed its own aerospace sector, produced its own satellite capability. The pressure designed to weaken the state forced the development of capabilities it would not otherwise have built. The framework does not call this a paradox. It calls this a law, a predictable outcome for a movement that does not break under pressure. But the second law is where this gets structurally different from any Western analysis I have found. Law number 2, the apparent defeat contains the next advance. In the pattern of sacred history, the moment of the greatest apparent weaknesses precedes the greatest advance. We already walked through the historical sequence: Badr, Uhud, Purifies, transformation. The worst revealed after the treaty that looked like a defeat. Indeed, we have given you a clear victory, not consolation, a structural prediction about what was coming next. Now let's test it. 2006, a full-scale campaign against the armed movement in Lebanon ends in ceasefire without achieving its stated objective. The Western analysis, the movement have been weakened. We followed a multi-year rebuilding period that produced a qualitatively more capable force than existed before 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014. 3 separate military operations in Gaza, each intended to destroy the governing authorities' military capability. What followed each one? A rebuilding period under full blockade that produced a more capable military structure than existed before. The claim is that the pattern, setback, consolidation, advance is observable, repeatable, and was described in advance. And strangely, the movement themselves read the historical sequence exactly this way. They do not describe their setbacks as defeat. They describe them using the Hudaybiyah framework. And that distinction between a movement that believes it is experiencing a temporary setback within a non-historical pattern and an opponent that believes it has achieved a decisive victory, that distinction has enormous strategic consequences. Law number 3, the narrative battle follows different rules. The battle over which story about history is true is the decisive battle, and it is won by the side whose story people recognize as justice. This is the most consequential law for understanding the present moment. The framework holds that every major conflict is simultaneously a military conflict and a narrative conflict. And these two battles follow completely different rules. By conventional logic, the side with more media infrastructure, more reach, more resources for content production should win the narrative war. Now look at what has actually happened. A 2024 Gallup survey found that among Americans under 30, support for Palestinian rights had reached a level not previously reached in the poll's history. A Harvard Youth poll from the same year found similar results. Campus demonstrations across Western universities in 2024 reached a scale not seen since the Vietnam War era. In France, Germany, United Kingdom, Australia, countries whose governments formally maintain their political position, public opinion among younger demographics ran in the opposite direction from official policy. The narrative war, by every available public opinion metric, is not being won by the side with more media resources. The framework's explanation is precise. A story that explains what people are already observing does not need a large distribution network. It needs to be true to evidence. And here is what connects all three laws. Each one describes a form of inversion, where the thing that should produce one result produces the opposite. Pressure should weaken, it purifies. Defeat should end movement, it consolidates them. Media dominance should win the narrative. Alignment with observed reality does. The framework has a name for this pattern of inversion. It calls it the divine narrative. Now I want to say something that I think is worth sitting with. What I have described so far, the three laws, might sound like a sophisticated analysis of why underdogs sometimes win. And it is that. But the framework that I'm drawing on is making a stronger claim. The movements at the center of this story are not just using clever strategy. They are operating inside a complete worldview, documented, systematic, internally consistent, that holds that history itself as a direction, that the specific events of our time correspond to a pattern in which a civilization that has accumulated enormous material power reaches what this framework calls its structural limits. And a movement that appears to have no material basis for victory begins against all conventional analysis to hold its ground. The framework was explicit about its predictions decades before the modern events, not vaguely, not symbolically. The specific claim is pressure would not break the movement. It would accelerate its internal development. Each setback would precede and advance. The narrative battle would not follow the same rules as the military battle. And, by the way, I'm not asking you to adopt a theological position. I'm asking you to notice something analytically significant. A framework that was explicit about its predictions and whose predictions had matched the historical record across 45 years deserves serious intellectual attention. More serious than it has received from an analytical establishment that has dismissed it without study. Not a claim about what you should believe, a claim about what 45 years of evidence requires you to take seriously. And let me bring this together. The conventional analytical framework tells you the movements in modern Middle East or West of Asia are collections of armed groups held together by external funding and strategic direction. They are structurally dependent on Iranian support. Sustained military and economic pressure will eventually cause them to fragment. This has been the dominant analysis for over 40 years. and the historical record has not confirmed it. The framework that I have described tells you something structurally different, that this movement's coherence does not come primarily from external funding or strategic direction. It comes from a shared interpretive framework, a way of understanding what is happening and why. That gives its participants a basis for sustained commitment that is not dependent on the material condition. And from a purely strategic perspective, that is an extraordinary different kind of adversity than the conventional framework assumes it is facing. You cannot disrupt a network by cutting its external funding if the network coherence is primarily internal. You cannot win the narrative war against a story that millions of people experience as the most accurate description of what they are watching. The mainstream cannot explain the West of Asia because it is analyzing a 1400-year-old story through a framework built in the last 2 centuries. And the story, as the 45-year record suggests, is not going in the direction that framework predicted. And I want to be honest about something. I started making this video wanting clarity. I wanted a clean answer to the question I have been setting for years. What I found instead was something more interesting than a clean answer. I found a framework that has been making precise prediction about history for 1400 years. And I found that the last 45 years of evidence, if you look at it honestly, fits that framework more accurately than any alternative I have found. That does not settle every equation. It opens new ones. There is a tradition within Islamic thought that holds that history is not a straight line. It is a pattern that repeats at different scales across different centuries until the pattern completes itself. If that tradition is right, then we are not watching a new story. We are watching a very old one. And the most important question is not which side wins the next military operation. It is which framework accurately describes what is actually happening. That is what this channel is about. In my next video, I want to show you specifically how American strategy in the Middle East was built on an assumption that this framework says was structurally impossible from the start. How the assumption was made and what followed from it. And I'll see you in that video. And by the way, if you like this kind of video, I highly recommend you to watch this one here right now that explains that 1400-year-old blueprint for you from A to Z. See you on this one.